Mary Stoltzfus was known in Lancaster County as a devoted Amish mother, the kind of woman who rose before dawn to milk cows, baked bread for neighbors, and tended her children with quiet care. That is why, when deputies discovered her 5-year-old son lifeless in a wooden wash tub behind the family's barn, the community was struck by disbelief. How could a woman so faithful, so gentle in appearance, commit such an unthinkable act? And why did she calmly tell investigators she was giving him back to God? What followed was a case that peeled back the layers of faith, fear, and hidden darkness in one of America's most private communities. In the heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the Amish way of life has always seemed like a world untouched by time. Rolling fields stretch out for miles, buggies roll steadily down winding roads, and barns stand proudly, painted in deep reds and weathered wood. To the outside world, this place is often romanticized as a haven of peace and purity, where families live in harmony with nature and faith. Yet beneath that quiet surface, there are human struggles, secrets, and tragedies, just as in any other community. What happened one spring morning would prove that even the most sheltered places can be shaken by unthinkable events. The day began like any other. The sun rose slowly over the farmland, casting soft golden light over the fields of alfalfa and corn. Men headed out to the barns to tend to livestock, and women moved through their morning routines, feeding chickens, sweeping porches, kneading dough. For the Amish, these tasks were not chores but daily rhythms, rituals that gave life a steady beat. Nothing about that morning suggested anything unusual. Children played in the yard, their laughter carrying faintly through the still air. The family at the center of this story looked no different from their neighbors. They lived in a modest wooden farmhouse, painted white with dark shutters, standing tall against the flat landscape. By mid-morning, though, the peace fractured. A call reached the county sheriff's office, though Amish homes rarely have telephones. The details were confused at first, but deputies quickly drove out, following dirt paths that led to the small farm. Their arrival startled neighbors who had gathered nearby. Drawn by the sound of urgency, horses stomped nervously in their stalls, as if sensing something was wrong. When officers entered the yard, the scene before them froze them in place. Behind the barn, in a shaded spot used for laundry, they found the source of the call. A wooden wash tub, usually filled with soapy water and linens, now held a sight that would haunt even seasoned investigators. The young boy, barely 5 years old, was pulled from the water, his small body limp and still. A hush fell over the scene as the deputies lifted him carefully, but it was already too late. Standing nearby was his mother, her plain dress clinging slightly to her, her bonnet tilted awkwardly, her face calm in a way that unsettled everyone present. She did not cry out. She did not rush forward. She simply stood, hands folded, her eyes downcast, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. Neighbors whispered among themselves, confusion and disbelief spreading like wildfire. This was a woman they had known all her life. She was known for being quiet, hard-working, devoted to her children. She sang hymns during church gatherings, baked bread for others in need, and tended her garden with patience. No one could imagine her as the cause of something so horrific. Yet here she was, a figure of stillness while tragedy unfolded around her. For the Amish community, where family and faith are considered sacred, the idea that a mother could harm her child was nearly impossible to comprehend. The deputies moved carefully, knowing they were now dealing with more than an accident. The air was heavy with shock, but beneath the shock was another feeling, a sense that something deeply unnatural had taken place. The boy's lifeless body, the calmness of his mother, and the silence of those who witnessed it combined into a scene that no one would ever forget. The investigation was only beginning. But already it was clear this was not a simple story of loss. It was something darker, something that would pierce the very heart of a community that believed itself safe from the tragedies of the outside world. As the news spread, investigators began the slow process of piecing together what had happened that morning. The farmhouse, so ordinary in appearance, suddenly became a crime scene. Deputies walked carefully through the yard and into the barn, taking in every detail. The wash tub, still filled with cloudy water, stood as the central piece of evidence. It was an everyday object in Amish life, used countless times for laundry, for chores, for soaking garments after long days in the fields. But now, its very purpose had been twisted into something unimaginable. Forensic teams noted its size, large enough for a small child to fit inside. What should have been a symbol of domestic life had turned into the centerpiece of a nightmare. The mother remained near the scene, her composure striking everyone present. She did not resist when questioned. She admitted, in quiet words, that she had placed her son into the tub. She spoke without hesitation, saying she had done it for God, that she was giving her child back to a higher power. These words, spoken with such unsettling calm, sent chills through the officers who heard them. There was no anger in her tone, no regret, only certainty. To law enforcement, it was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Detectives worked to understand her state of mind. They searched the house for signs of a struggle or any other explanation. The rooms were tidy, the kitchen table neatly arranged, the children's toys put away. Nothing seemed out of place except for the chilling absence of life from the boy who had once filled the home with energy. A sense of order surrounded everything, as if the act itself had been carried out deliberately, without chaos, without second thoughts. That realization disturbed investigators even more. This was not a crime born out of sudden rage or a fleeting moment of weakness. It appeared methodical, intentional, and rooted in belief. Neighbors were interviewed, each one struggling to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they thought they knew. Many described her as quiet, almost withdrawn, but never dangerous. Some recalled how she was deeply religious, perhaps more than most, speaking often of sin and salvation. Others mentioned her reserved demeanor, how she rarely smiled and often seemed burdened by something she never shared. No one had ever suspected that her inner world was dark enough to lead to this. The contrast between the life she presented and the actions she took created a puzzle that authorities were determined to solve. As the hours passed, more unsettling details emerged. She explained to officers that she had been troubled for weeks, convinced that evil was creeping into her household. She believed the outside world was poisoning her son, even though he was so young. The television, the internet, the temptations of modernity, these were things the Amish strictly avoided, yet in her mind, their influence was unavoidable, seeping in like a poison. She convinced herself that her child's soul was at risk, and that only by returning him to God could she protect him. For the officers hearing this explanation, the situation shifted from one of simple criminality to one of disturbing psychology. They had dealt with violence before, but this was different. This was not a mother who lost control in anger. This was a woman who believed she was carrying out a sacred duty. The idea chilled them because it meant reason alone would not explain what had happened. The boy's death was not the result of chance or carelessness. It was the outcome of a conviction, an act carried out with purpose, leaving investigators to wonder just how far her beliefs might have driven her if she had not been stopped. The journals found inside the modest farmhouse became the key to understanding what had driven the tragedy. Tucked away in a wooden chest at the foot of her bed, they were written in careful handwriting, each page filled with neat lines and somber reflections. At first glance, they read like the private prayers of a devout woman, passages filled with scripture and notes about daily tasks. But as investigators read further, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, more troubled, as though a shadow had slowly taken over her thoughts. She wrote about dreams that visited her night after night, dreams where voices whispered that her son did not belong on earth much longer. In her mind, these were not dreams at all but messages from God, instructions she dared not ignore. She recorded her fears that the world was intruding in ways she could not control. Even without electricity or phones in her home, she feared corruption was slipping in through unseen cracks. She described her child as innocent but vulnerable, and she believed he was already being targeted by forces of sin. The writings suggested she had convinced herself that resisting these visions would bring ruin to her entire family. It was not just about one child in her mind, but about eternal salvation for all of them. Investigators turned to experts who studied religious psychology and cases of delusion. The pattern they saw was chilling. Her journals matched what they recognized as religious mania, a condition where faith became so entangled with fear that it distorted reality. Each entry seemed to confirm she had been building toward her actions for weeks, maybe months. She wrote of feeling chosen, of carrying a burden others could not understand, of believing that God demanded a sacrifice from her. It painted the picture of a woman isolated in her mind, with no one to challenge or question the path she was taking. What struck detectives most was how normal her life had appeared from the outside. She continued to cook meals, tend the garden, and attend Sunday gatherings. She sewed clothes for her children, baked pies, and spoke politely to her neighbors. No outward sign gave away the storm brewing inside her. Her faith, something the Amish community prized above all else, had become twisted into a force that blinded her. She did not see herself as a criminal or even as a grieving mother. In her mind, she believed she had fulfilled a divine duty. The journals also revealed how lonely she felt, though she never voiced it aloud. She wrote of her husband's long hours in the fields, her exhaustion from caring for the children, and her sense of being unseen. To the community, she blended into the backdrop of everyday life, yet on the pages of her journals, she poured out fears and beliefs that grew darker with every entry. By the final weeks, her words carried an unmistakable certainty. She no longer questioned whether her visions were real. She believed wholeheartedly that she had been chosen to act. For investigators, these discoveries were as tragic as they were illuminating. The boy's death was not a random act of violence, nor was it the result of momentary despair. It was the final step in a journey that had unfolded silently, hidden in the lines of her journals, written in the quiet hours of the night while her family slept peacefully in the rooms around her. When relatives began speaking to detectives, a new layer of the story emerged, one that pushed the investigation into far more unsettling territory. At first, family members were hesitant. The Amish are known for handling struggles within their own circle, relying on faith and forgiveness rather than involving outsiders. But as questions mounted, some relatives reluctantly shared memories that had long been buried. They recalled another child, a baby who had died years before. The explanation at the time had been simple. The infant did not wake from sleep, no one had pressed further, no authorities had been called, and the burial had been carried out quietly, as was common in their community. It was accepted as God's will, and life moved forward. Now, in the shadow of this new tragedy, those memories carried a darker weight. Detectives began to wonder if the baby's death had truly been natural or if it had been an early sign of something more sinister. The possibility chilled them. Had this pattern begun years earlier, unnoticed because of the community's reluctance to question tragedy? If so, how many opportunities had been missed to prevent what had just occurred? Forensic teams attempted to revisit the older case, but the lack of medical records and the passage of time left little evidence to work with. Still, the suspicion lingered. What made the situation even more complex was the way relatives described the mother's behavior through the years. They spoke of her quiet intensity, her tendency to retreat into her thoughts, and her habit of quoting scripture in ways that felt unsettling. Some remembered her long absences from family gatherings, times when she would excuse herself to pray alone for hours. At the time, it was dismissed as piety. Now, it looked more like isolation feeding into dangerous ideas. Investigators also noticed a pattern of secrecy in the broader Amish community. In their desire to protect their way of life from outside intrusion, many families handled grief privately. Illnesses, sudden deaths, and even accidents were often spoken of in hushed tones, quickly moved past with the explanation that it was all part of God's plan. This way of thinking, while rooted in faith, also created a silence that could conceal warning signs. Detectives realized that they might never know the full truth of how many tragedies had unfolded unnoticed behind the white walls of farmhouses like this one. The more they spoke to relatives, the clearer it became that her actions had not appeared overnight. There were hints, faint and scattered, that had gone unrecognized. A cousin remembered her speaking once about dreams of children being called to heaven. A sister recalled a letter where she wrote of feeling cursed as though her family was marked by unseen forces. These details, dismissed at the time, now painted a picture of someone slowly unraveling while those closest to her looked away, unable or unwilling to imagine where such thoughts could lead. For investigators, the hardest realization was that this tragedy might not stand alone. It could be the latest chapter in a story stretching back years, a story hidden under the cloak of tradition, faith, and silence. The farmhouse, once a symbol of simplicity and devotion, had become a place where questions lingered in every corner. And while one child's death was undeniable, the shadows cast by earlier losses left detectives with the sense that much more might remain concealed beneath the surface. The trial that followed drew attention far beyond Lancaster County. For a community that avoided newspapers, cameras, and the noise of modern society, suddenly their world was thrust into headlines across the nation. Outside the courthouse, news vans lined the street while journalists spoke into cameras, trying to explain how a place known for its quiet simplicity had become the backdrop of a story so dark. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, every bench filled with Amish families sitting in silence, their plainclothes and solemn expressions a stark contrast to the flashing cameras outside. They came not to speak, but to witness, their very presence a reminder of the weight of the case. Prosecutors laid out the evidence carefully, step by step. They presented the wash tub, the photographs of the scene, and the haunting words from her journals. They described a woman who, in their view, had taken her faith to a place it was never meant to go. They emphasized her confession, her own admission that she believed she was giving her son to God. The picture they painted was one of intent, of a deliberate act carried out with full awareness, even if distorted by belief. The defense, however, pushed back with a very different story. They argued that she was not a cold-blooded killer, but a woman overtaken by delusion and mental illness. They pointed to her writings as evidence of a fractured mind, not a malicious heart. Experts testified about religious psychosis, explaining how deep faith, isolation, and mental instability could combine to create a reality so convincing that no reasoning could break through it. To them, she was not acting with evil in her heart, but with a desperate conviction that she was doing what was necessary to save her child's soul. The jury sat through days of testimony, their faces grave as they listened to every detail. There were no outbursts, no heated exchanges, only a steady stream of evidence that carried a heavy emotional toll. For many, the most difficult part was hearing about the little boy, his short life, the innocence lost, and the way it ended so abruptly in a place meant to be safe. The courtroom felt the weight of his absence, a reminder of why they were there. When the verdict finally came, it was met with silence. The jury found her guilty, though the sentence reflected an acknowledgement of her mental state. She would spend years in a secure facility rather than a traditional prison, a decision meant to balance justice with compassion for her condition. For some, it was not enough. For others, it was the only answer that made sense. No sentence could ever bring back the child, and no judgment could fully capture the complexity of what had happened. As the case closed, the Amish community withdrew further into itself. They returned to their farms and fields, to their prayers and hymns, carrying with them the weight of what had unfolded. Yet beneath the surface, questions remained. How could faith and fear become so tangled? How many signs had been missed, ignored, or dismissed? And in a world that prized silence, how many other tragedies had gone unspoken? The courthouse emptied, the cameras left, but the shadows of that farmhouse lingered, a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, darkness can sometimes take root.